Good morning, I'm Rusty Lloyd. I'm the Executive Director of River's Edge West. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us again for another installment of our webinar series. I'd like to introduce Mark Briggs. So he will be presenting on the main steps and considerations for developing stream restorations that will be viable into the long-term future. Mark has a rich background, history, and career on doing restoration ecology in the Southwest. And so today he's going to present on some aspects of his restoration guide that him and 55 other experts across North America and Australia compiled. So a very meaty book, and so we're looking forward to having Mark present on that restoration guide that is soon to be released. So without further ado, I'll ask Mark to hop on and we get going. So again, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Rusty. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thanks everybody out in webinar land for joining us. This is great. Real honor and pleasure to be here with you all. As Rusty noted, the focus of my talk is going to be on some of the main steps in developing a stream restoration program or project, and specifically talking a little bit about this guidebook that a bunch of us cobbled together that's coming out next month. I can't believe it. And it's being printed by the university, distributed by the University of Arizona Press. And the underlining message of the guidebook and this presentation is that even though bringing back a damaged stream, there's a lot of challenges in that. There's a lot of great people out there doing a lot of great work that provide a wealth of lessons learned that we could take stock of for the future. And so that's really kind of the underlining message of this presentation and the guidebook. Can't acknowledge everybody that took part in the guidebook. As I said, it has a lot of authors, but I do want to recognize my co-editor and some of the lead authors. Wade Osterkamp was with the USGS for many years, did a lot of great research on stream hydrology and movement of sediment channel morphology. Sarah White is at the U of A at the Arizona Institutes for Resilience. She led the chapter on climate change. Amy McCoy is an expert on EFlow, environmental flow, and she has her own consulting firm called Martin & McCoy. And Daniel Bunting led the restoration implementation chapter and the monitoring chapter, and he's with Fish and Wildlife Service. I definitely want to recognize them. Just a bit of background on the guidebook and how this all came about. The spark for it came from communication between two binational teams, one working in the Colorado River Delta and the other in the Big Bend region of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. You can see some of the groups, organizations, agencies that were involved in both teams there. But what we started to do, this is going back 15, 20 years, we started to compare notes between our two efforts. What are the main challenges that we were facing, how we were addressing them, what are some of the lessons that we learned, and the comparison of notes was so fruitful that we decided it'd be great to involve others. And we had a stream restoration lessons learned conference in 2010. And somebody after the conference had the bright idea that, it'd be nice to do something other than a conference proceedings after the conference. And somebody thought, well, wouldn't it be great to do a guidebook? And that's where it started. And a lot of work, research done since then, a lot of others involved in this effort. So three major countries, Australia, Mexico, and the US involved, but that was sort of the foundation. In a nutshell overview of the guidebook, emphasis is on stream restoration, of course, and in dryland regions. As I mentioned, there are three countries involved, and so we looked, most of the case studies in the guidebook come from Australia, Mexico, northern Mexico, and southwestern US. And the guidebook itself follows, I mean, the theme or the plot, I guess, if you will, follows the arc of developing a stream. What are the main steps in developing a stream corridor restoration project? As I mentioned earlier, case studies are the background. So, the main points in each of the chapters are underscored by case studies, mostly, as I said, from one of the 3 countries. There are 55 authors. We certainly didn't start that way. We did not in any way at the very beginning of this effort decide, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea to write a book with 55 authors? But that's the way it culminated, particularly with the inclusion of a variety of different case studies. The author list grew, and essentially we ended up with quite a robust restoration community that was behind the book. 3 countries involved, 5 authors from Australia, 12 from Mexico, 38 from the US. Good mix of experience, good balance between practitioners, restoration practitioners, and scientists. Also managers. Several of the authors were in the agency management arena, and a couple authors from agriculture and business. The main audience for the book is anybody that's really interested in developing a program for stream restoration. We wanted to provide a guidebook that had the technical chops for people who have been doing this kind of work for years, as well as somebody that would be helpful for somebody that might be approaching it anew. It would give them the proper guidance to work through a stream restoration program. What our aim was in terms of sort of the ethos of the book, we wanted it to be applied and practical. We wanted it to really kind of provide some of the main steps. What do you do first? What do you do second? It's certainly not like building a shelf. I mean, a stream ecosystem is kind of a living entity compared to a shelf, but with the cartoon there, you may not be able to read the caption, but it says, you're ready for the instructions yet. We did kind of want to provide in the guidebook this semblance of, what do you do first? What makes sense to do first and second, third, with the understanding that it is, at least in terms of stream restoration, a very iterative process. The tone and syntax, stream restoration is inherently technical, and so, but we wanted to do our best to develop a book that is inviting, and so you could pick it up and it's readable. It doesn't have a lot of jargon. Of course, there's vocabulary there that you may not be familiar with, if you're not in the stream restoration world, and that, we have that defined, and then, like I said earlier, just to provide kind of a stepwise flow to it. We certainly didn't want to overwhelm, and what we presumed was, with regard to our audience, was that many folks who are picking up books like this, like Renewing Our Rivers, are folks that may have modest funding, or maybe even no funding, and are just beginning the process. And so, again, it's sort of this way of inviting them in and saying, okay, take a breath. Here's what you can do first. Here's what might make sense to do second. Here are some things you can do that are not inherently expensive with regard to funding and time. And then we don't want to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of great books out there on stream restoration. And so when we hit in the guidebook, when we hit areas that are well trodden, we definitely, it kind of turns into a reference book. It's like, okay, here's the next step. This is well documented. Here are a bunch of references for you that you could take advantage of and dive deeper into if you are interested. The book, as I mentioned, follows the main arc of developing a stream restoration program. So it's divided into kind of 4 on the right side of the slide there, four kind of sections, I guess. A planning section, section we call emerging themes, and a section on implementation and then post-implementation. The planning involves, the heart of it is developing realistic restoration goals and objectives, as well as understanding what are the conditions of your watershed and stream. And the idea of the planning is that you're coming out of the planning phase with viable stream restoration objectives and tactics to achieve them. And in the emerging theme section, there are 2 chapters, one on how vulnerable the restoration objectives that you have developed thus far are to the impacts of climate change. And then the other chapter 5 there, is on EFlow, environmental flow, what types of actions you could do to understand how vulnerable your stream flow is and your water resources are to impacts potentially in the future, and how those impacts might compromise your restoration objectives and what you can do to address that. And then the implementation phase, which is one chapter, the largest chapter in the book, is on, what do you do when you get to the point, you got your objective lined up, you got your tactics, you're just about to take your first shovelful of dirt, so to speak, and you're about to actually implement the tactics. What are some lessons learned from the field on project implementation? And in chapter 7, this is post-implementation phase, monitoring and evaluating the results of your work, of your restoration project. And then chapter 8, going long, is the emphasis there is that when you reach the restoration finish line, so to speak, that it's not, at least it should not be a finish line. It should be, it's the emphasis of that chapter is on what you can do to take it to the next step, enhance the results of the work that you have done, and continue to work and expand on results. So before going any further, I just wanted to clarify a couple terms, just so we're all on the same page here. Restoration, of course, is a key one for the book. That's what it's about. And you may have, for those of you that are in ecology, restoration, it has been used in the past and continues to be, to some extent, to imply taking an ecosystem or what have you back to pre-impact. And for the guidebook, anyway, what we define as restoration is much broader. And the definition we put forward is really an improvement. It's any action that improves a damaged stream's condition and toward a state that's enhanced by increased resilience and decreased vulnerability to stressors, providing habitat for native species, as well as enhanced ecosystem services for people. So much broader use of restoration for the guidebook. And the other term I wanted to just quickly define is stream corridor, as opposed to just saying stream restoration, saying stream corridor restoration, or at least implying that. For the guidebook, what we wanted to get out in front at the very beginning is that it's what we're looking at here is, at least spatially, a much broader perspective. We're not looking at just the stream. We're looking at the stream in the context of its watershed. The watershed is the fundamental organizing unit for all the work that is involved in stream restoration, and so that is a part of the stream corridor definition. And also, at least for the guidebook, what we're focusing on are physical processes versus, say, biologic or chemical processes. So, the physical template is what is provided for the biota as well as for the ecosystem services. And so understanding those physical processes is key. And then also temporally, it's a broader definition too, that we kind of inherently tag on to the definition of stream corridor, is that we're not just looking at the past, and understanding, what the stream was like in the past, what the stream corridor was like in the past, and how it has changed to its current condition, but we're also nodding to the future and trying to figure out just what the trends and what future conditions might be in store for us in the future. And all this, makes for realistic restoration objectives and the tactics that you're putting forward. Climate change is a great example. You're kind of looking at the futures, understanding climate change and how climate change might impact the hydrology of your stream, and how that in turn might impact, your restoration objectives that you're developing, as well as the tactics. So stream corridor restoration, a little bit broader. Okay, what I'm hoping to do the next few minutes here is I'll walk you through a couple of the chapters here, and just hit some of the highlights of some of the case studies and some of the great authors involved and lessons learned, give you a taste of what are some of the main steps involved in stream corridor restoration, and hope you get give you a feel of kind of some of the lessons learned that we've compiled for the guidebook. So chapter 2 here is focused on developing realistic stream corridor restoration goals. That's sort of the heart of it. The chapter is called Some Assembly Required. The idea here is that before you get some funding, or you're trying to get your head around what it might mean to do a restoration project for a damaged stream in your neck of the woods, there's planning that's needed to be involved. And at the heart of that, you really need to come out of that planning effort with long-term viable stream restoration goals and objectives. That's really the heart of Chapter 2. And then also we cover forming your restoration team there, as well as how your restoration objectives, once you have them, and particularly if you have multiple, how they might be prioritized with regard to location and time. And so one of the things that we spend some time on in Chapter 2 is what are the characteristics of a sound stream restoration objective, and we walk the readers through five characteristics in particular. Objectives need to be realistic. If your intent is to reestablish a wetland in a valley that's been dewatered, is it realistic from an economic and scientific standpoint to do that? Can it realistically be done? Objectives also need to be quantifiable. Can you actually, when you look at your objectives and you implement the tactics to achieve them, and 5 years down the road, can you actually measure how the progress that you're achieving 5 years from now, and how well you're achieving those objectives? They need to be scientifically defensible. If your idea is to establish that wetland that I mentioned in a dewatered area, is this something that can actually be done? And also economically. I mean, if you're doing a wetland in a dewatered area, if you had $1 million, you might be able to do it. If you have just $10,000, you probably will not be able to do it. So definitely thinking about these things goes into a sound restoration objective. Also, flexibility is also key. If your restoration objective is really tight with regard to the time period that you want to achieve it, 1 year from today, we're going to have this on the ground. There's always the things that are unanticipated that could thwart that. And so having both temporal and spatial flexibility in your restoration objectives, instead of 1 year, we're going to have this done, between 1 and 3 years, we're going to have this done, and we're going to have it done along maybe 10 miles of your stream versus just 1, something like that will give you a little bit better chance of realizing your objectives. A couple of the case studies that we put forward in Chapter 2 to kind of underscore some of these points. One of them is from the Murray-Darling Basin. For those of you that are familiar with stream restoration efforts around the world, you probably are familiar with this. It's a multi-decadal effort to bring back parts of the Murray-Darling Basin in southeastern Australia, and they have numerous objectives that are sort of under one main arching goal. And so we review some of the restoration objectives, some of the qualities of them, and then look too also as to how they prioritize them. Here's a picture of Lindsay White, who's one of the authors of the chapter. So with the Murray cod there, which he dutifully put back in the river after he held it. But what they did in the Murray-Darling Basin was really interesting. They definitely, in terms of prioritizing the restoration objectives that they had, they put a lot of effort into kind of figuring out what objectives might be accomplished first versus second, or which ones might be a little bit easier too. So they had they had some victories early on in the process that they can point to that would then garner support for the longer term. So we discussed those type of things in Chapter 2. We also, with regard to developing restoration objectives, we talk a lot about where might be some fairly accessible and potentially even free areas to get good information on what might constitute a sound objective for your restoration site. So we talk a bit about reference sites and how to use them, some of the limitations on using them. And so this is one example that we put forward this is along the Santa Cruz River, not far from where I live in Tucson, and this is the river as it flows through a protected area called Tumacacori. And this site was used in this particular case study as a reference site for a site downstream with the Tohono O'odham Nation on a restoration project. And so we talk about the use of reference sites, what you got to be careful of, how they can be valuable, that type of thing. But the idea is when you're done with Chapter 2, you've got a good handle on what it takes to develop sound and viable stream restoration objectives. And the next chapter focuses on evaluating conditions. And there's the double arrow there between chapter 2 and chapter 3 indicates that, it's a feedback, it's iterative. You're developing your stream restoration objectives, but you're also doing a lot of other things where you're increasing your knowledge of your stream and its watershed. Chapter 3 focuses on, conditions and how conditions have changed. And you certainly are, as you're developing your objective, you're learning more about the conditions, and the conditions feed into what might constitute a realistic restoration objective for your stream, and vice versa. You're going to be as your stream restoration objectives evolve with greater knowledge, you're going to be identifying knowledge gaps that'll feed into how you go about evaluating stream conditions. That's the reason for that double arrow there. So chapter 3 focuses on assessing hydrology, and our focus, again, as I mentioned earlier, is on physical. We do certainly talk about the biota and chemistry, water quality in particular, but the focus is on the physical environment, on water and sediment movement in particular. The central questions that we address in chapter 3 are to what extent the stream corridor has changed, when did the changes begin, and what are the current trends? How do past conditions correlate to today, and what are the main causes that are driving those changes? And one of the great challenges when you're looking at questions like that is that we all face in these types of projects is, what does it take to answer them? Or when have you sufficiently answered them? And you can look at sort of two extremes on the knowledge expenditure meter. One is doing, virtually nothing. You got some money maybe to go out and do something, implement something on your damaged stream, and you go out and you with very little understanding of your stream system and its watershed, you spend little time on that, and the risk is, of course, that it might compromise your entire program. And the other extreme is you spend all your resources, all your time and money doing one study after the next, a huge laundry list of things, and you end up with a great understanding maybe of your stream and your watershed, but you don't have any resources left to actually implement. And so there's a middle sweet spot that we are constantly sort of talking about in the guidebook, as to something where you need to kind of hit this area with targeted, practical, taking advantage of available data and information. And then when you need to collect more and do your own investigation, it needs to be really targeted and based on specific gaps of information that you need to iron out your restoration objectives. So chapter 3 is in 2 sections. One is focused on what is already known and collecting that information and data, and then what you see in your watershed, through reconnaissance. And then the second section is on, if once you do that, is then addressing critical key information gaps that are related to your restoration objectives. And so the way the chapter rolls or flows is we look through basics, and all this, some of this stuff, like in number 1 there, is covered, and this is where the guidebook turns to a reference book. We look at some of these basics, but number 2 there, what we do is we look at these basics in stream hydrology, but really underscoring why some of these concepts is important. Why do you need to understand where your watershed, delineate where your watershed is, and stream flow and morphology? Why is that important to your stream restoration objectives? And then where can you find that information? In many cases, it's often for free. And then reconnaissance, using targeted field reconnaissance to address gaps. And when all that comes to fruition, and you still have some gaps that you really want to address, is how to target your own investigations. And then underscoring all of it with real life examples. So we talk about field reconnaissance, where to go, how to get the best prepared, who to take with you, what kind of expertise, maybe what kind of instrumentation, where and when to go is really key. It might be better to go during the driest, hottest time of the year when you do your field work, just to understand what some of the conditions are during that period with regard to what might be accomplished for stream restoration. And of course, what to look at when you get there. And we provide examples through the chapter. What does it mean when you're looking at a variety of bridges in the field, for example, where the sediment has been evacuated, or root systems of trees. That could mean that the stream is in sediment deficit. What does that mean to your stream restoration objectives and what you can realistically accomplish? And conversely, if you're looking at a stream or a river that has gravel plugs at tributary confluences that have staying power, what does that mean? That could mean your stream is in sediment surplus. What does that mean to your stream restoration objectives and the tactics that you might use? So it's that kind of information that we underscore with real life examples. And then the use of photo points, we get into that a little bit too, is how you look at the past. Say, for example, in this photograph of a small tributary coming into the Rio Bravo in 1936. This is the conditions during that period, and then same photo point in 2006, and then you compare that, say, to 2020 when you go out there, present day, and then what kind of information should you be looking at? What does that information tell you? So it's those examples that we underscore. And then when you have data readily available, what kind of analysis that you might do? And so we go through a few examples too of, like, if you're lucky enough to have a couple of streamflow gauges with long-term records, what might be a useful analysis that would give you some great insight. And this is an example from Dean and Schmidt and that they did to look at pre and post dam development along the Rio Bravo and what that actually meant for hydrology along the river, and how that portrayed to current conditions. And then you're going to have gaps, right? And so what kind of things that you can do to address gaps in your own for your own stream restoration program. And so we have a couple examples of some practical things that you can do. Installing pressure transducers to measure stage is a really great example. It can be done relatively cheaply, and you can then put them in and then develop your own stage discharge work. So we get into that kind of those kind of examples at the end of the chapter. The two emerging themes chapters. So the idea is that you come out of the planning stage with well-developed, thoughtful stream restoration objectives, and then the question is, how might climate change affect those objectives? Or will they make them will climate change make those objectives unrealistic? And will you need to pursue an environmental flow program? And so chapter 4 is on climate change. I'm going to be getting into this a little bit next week, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Plus, I'm looking at the clock here. I'm kind of running a little behind, so I'll go through this really quickly with the idea that, for this chapter anyway, I'll go with the idea that next week we'll be talking about this. But the focus of the climate change chapter is essentially this: is that if your restoration project, if your restoration objectives are not climate adapted, it's really likely they're not going to be successful in the future. And so the idea here is to not only understand how vulnerable your current stream restoration objectives are to climate change, but then what can you do about it? And so we talk about how and why climate is changing as kind of an intro, and sources for climate data and projections. And then we start talking and there's a variety of strategies that you can use to apply climate information to sub-basin scale that could be worthy of pursuing. And then we spend a good chunk of the chapter talking about strategies for assessing the vulnerability of your restoration objectives. And then if your restoration objectives are wanting in that regard, what you can do about it. And so the flow goes from, understanding climate change impacts on hydrology, and then understanding what your objectives are. And we go through sources of information with focus on Mexico, Australia, and the US, where climate information can be provided. And then a section on downscaling climate models and information to a scale that's pertinent to your own restoration work. And then you end up with your restoration project in either one of three camps. The camp 1 is your stream restoration objectives are adapted to climate change, and at least now you don't have probably as much to worry about. Camp 2 is you're on the edge, and there might be things you can do to strengthen the adaptability of your objectives to climate change. And Camp 3 is the holy smokes. You really potentially need to go back to square one with regard to your objectives and adapting them to climate change. And we focus the remainder of the chapter on those Camp 2 and 3 and looking at ways that you could strengthen the climate adaptation strength of your objectives. And I will get into this a little bit more next week. So for the EFlow chapter, we talk about, essentially your flow, your stream flow, and the water resources of your stream are the key factor in determining whether or not your stream objectives might be achieved. And so there may be need to put effort into protecting those resources and or even augmenting them through an environmental flow program. And so that's what the focus of this chapter is on, is EFlow, which we define here as the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows that are required to sustain freshwater estuarine ecosystems for humans and native species. In the bottom line for why this can be so important for many streams in dryland regions is that once streams collect their natural contributions of snow and rain and descend from the mountains to the valley floor, the water's used up. Often many of these watersheds are over allocated for human use, and there's just a few drops that are remaining. And so how can you go about protecting those drops for native ecosystems and ecosystem services? That's the theme of this chapter. And so the flow of the chapter is it goes from background on EFlow to assessing the potential need for you to pursue an EFlow program, and then if you do have a need, how you might go about quantifying what that need is, and conducting a water inventory of like who is doing what with water in your watershed, and then we look at environmental flows strategies from the field. So again, that's a key part of this. We look at examples from all over the place. We have this example, for example, in Colorado, of moving a point of diversion, downstream. This is kind of a low-hanging fruit one, but it's often can be really important if there's a section of your stream that's key to protect, and you're moving a point of diversion downstream. You're essentially allowing that water to flow in a key part of the stream system, and where it wasn't before. So that could be really important, and is a good example of an EFlow program, which was done in Colorado. One from Chihuahua, Mexico, concerns the Julimas pupfish, which resides in Julimas in Chihuahua in no more than like 600 square meters of hot springs. But the purpose of this case study, at least in part, was to show that even getting legal precedent for a small area, as small as 600 square meters, to protect a fish can provide the basis for national precedent. So this was a case study and how that evolved, where Mauricio de la Maza and his crew from Pro Natura moved up a legal case study on protecting the waters for the Julimas up the national chain to Conagua, and the importance of that. And then on a totally another scale, in the EFlow world, is the 2014 pulse flow in the Colorado River Delta. Big, large project, decadal in its coming. What were the lessons here, and how could what did that portend to the Colorado River Delta itself, as well as what are some of the take-home lessons for developing your own environmental flow program? So the idea is that you now have, you've taken it, you've got a realistic restoration objective. You've got some tactics in mind to implement it. You've taken consideration of climate change and EFlow, and now you're ready to put the first shovel in the ground. And the idea of this chapter, chapter 6, is what are some of the main lessons learned from implementing those projects. And so what we do in this chapter is we look at, on the right there, we look at sort of four main parts, four main types of stream restoration projects. One that are kind of community-based, where that was a big focus. Others that were focused more on managing non-native species, other on riparian re-veg, and then on bringing back, restoring desert fish. Those are sort of the four types of projects that we focused on. For the community-based, this was an example of one where the case study came out of work done in northern Sonora on the Santa Cruz River within Ejido. really great example of joint objectives coming to fruition, where on the environmental side, you want, you want a healthier stream, you want more water in a stream, you want native species to come back. From the rancher side of things, they want healthier cows. And so how do you bring those two objectives together? In this case, it was, an example of improved cattle grazing management combined with construction of gabions to slow water down and improve infiltration. And then on the section on battling non-natives, we turn our attention to non-natives, vegetation, riparian zones, several case studies in there. And we focus on really what are some of the key considerations that you need to take into account before you even begin a program on battling non-native species. And one of the big key lessons from a lot of these projects is that, a lot of these species, a lot of these non-native species are there because the hydrology of the river has changed. They are well adapted to the changed hydrology. And then if you don't bring back the changed hydrology in some way, what is it that you think you're going to be accomplishing? It's that type of argument, debate, I guess is a better word, that you need to have before you even entertain an effort that's focused solely on battling non-native species, or at least in part. And so a lot of these lessons draw out some of that. And of course, what was done, how do you go about tackling various non-native riparian species? And here's one example from the Rio Grande Bravo battling giant cane. And then for the riparian re-veg, there's a lot of examples we focus on here, everything from revegetation actions on small desert streams to big projects like ones done by the Bureau of Reclamation, off-channel re-veg projects on the lower Colorado River, and then everything in between. So it's a real interesting bunch of case studies there that we look at, going through a lot of the main steps of how to do riparian re-veg, what makes sense, what doesn't, that type of thing. And then we end the chapter on with focus on non-native fish. I'm sorry, with a focus on restoring native fish, and a great example from the Lake Alexandria and Lake Albert in Australia, where they're doing some great work on restoring small-bodied native fish to this ecosystem. We really try in the guidebook to make a strong connection between aquatic restoration and riparian. Bringing those two worlds which are often separate, and bring them closer together. Chapter 7 is on monitoring, and the idea here is to, now you've done your implementation, what is it that you need to do, the importance of monitoring, and how do you measure progress towards achieving your restoration goals. We focus on, there's 3 sections. We look at, we talk about what makes for robust monitoring programs. We look at how do you develop clear monitoring objectives? What are the key questions that you want to ask? How do you protect funding? Monitoring is always getting the short end of funding, and how to potentially get some more and protect that funding so you can actually do the monitoring when you're, in the years after your restoration project is done. The importance of initiating monitoring prior to implementing your tactics, establishing control sites. We go through a lot of what are some of the considerations. And then we talk about what are some of the main steps. And so there are 5 steps that we walk readers through, how to go about defining your monitoring objectives. What are the methods that you might want to consider, locations, what are the parameters, the statistical approach that you might want to use, how your monitoring might be laid out, the number of sampling points you might need, that type of thing. And then managing the data. We talk about that a lot. That's often something that's not considered when people are developing their monitoring program. And then analysis, of course, and how to go about sharing results. So those are the main parts of developing your monitoring program. And then we focus on riparian veg monitoring, birds, fish, channel morphology, stream flow, and we talk about how to use remote sensing platforms to complement on-the-ground monitoring as well. So we talk about, there's some good examples from the field on monitoring channel morphology, riparian veg here. There's a plot getting surveyed in by an RTK system. Here's what riparian veg often looks like, at least when I've done it. And we talk a lot about birds, and it's great. The idea, one of the ideas of bird monitoring is to connect the dots. So if you're if your restoration project is dealing with aquatics, how do you connect the dots between, what's happening in your aquatic environment after restoration, how well you're getting to objectives, but in turn, how that might be affecting the riparian part and birds, and so you're, connecting through different trophic levels in an ideal monitoring program. There's some case studies on monitoring shallow groundwater, how to pick wells, how to install piezometers, what makes most sense, how to do it cheaply. These are examples from the San Pedro River in southeastern Arizona. And from the same river system, PNC has implemented a great wet-dry mapping protocol, which we highlight as part of understanding the impacts of their work on stream flow availability and how that has changed through the years. And then combining that with the shallow groundwater monitoring gives them a really excellent sound picture of how well their restoration efforts are being achieved along that river system. And then the last chapter, going long, is about how do you, so you've reached, you've done your implementation, you've finished, you're conducting monitoring, and the main theme of this chapter is conveying the message of not like just taking your marbles and going home, after you're done. Is how to stay put along the stream system that you're working on in the watershed and expand on initial results for the long term. Many of these stream systems that we're working on, particularly some of the larger ones, have been damaged by hundreds of years of human use, and some cases billions of dollars if you look at dams. And so a 3-year project, whatever, small grant, is only going to go so far in moving the needle. And so what can you do to stay longer? And so we talk about some ideas that are, and all from, of course, our projects in the past from the 3 countries. And one is throw a party. Getting to the finish line, or at least a perceived finish line, is always a good feeling. Nothing better. Have a party. Not only invite people to that have been working with you throughout the years of your restoration program, but invite others to see the work that you've done and get excited about it. Invite journalists. It's a good example from the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo of we took a bunch of reporters from the New York Times downstream. They spent several days with us in the field and wrote an article. So always good publicity to get for the long term. Definitely the local community, get them to the site. Why is doing restoration along the river important to them? Get businesses and foundations involved. Take them on the river. This photo here involves folks from Coca-Cola. In this particular case study, they went down on numerous occasions for multiple days on the river and got pretty excited about it. So making that connection is really critical. Definitely develop your own restoration material. That gives you the advantage of being in control of the information that you're disseminating. Great example is the conservation priorities in the Colorado River Delta. Beautiful booklet that came out that really sparked a lot of interest in bringing back the Colorado River Delta. And social media is highlighted too. This is an example from some of the Sonora institutes of social media that they're using in the Colorado River Delta to highlight their work and bring together a whole vast swath of community in the Delta to join them on restoration. Okay, sorry I had to hurry there. I was getting kind of a little bit panicked over the time, but I made it. But thank you. And I guess, Rusty, are you gonna, if there are questions, we've got a few minutes, it looks like.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Great information, and obviously a lot to unpack. So we look forward to hearing more about it. So I wanted to remind everyone to click on the bubble icon in the top right-hand corner. Submit your questions to us so we can get some answers back to you. Mark, we do have one. Are there non-point source and/or water quality best management practice parameters generally considered in monitoring stream restoration projects?
Short answer is yes. Obviously, yeah, absolutely, there are. As I mentioned, a lot of our focus in the monitoring is on those 3 sections that I highlighted, which are the veg, the birds, stream flow, channel morphology, and remote sensing. So we had to cut somewhere. So we don't highlight water quality, but they're in one of the other chapters, chapter 3, where we talk about conditions and trends. We highlight a lot of great references dealing with monitoring of water quality, both point and non-point source of water quality, and how that pertains to understanding trends and current conditions.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question, Mark, where can people go to order the book?
You can go to this website. Or you can just Google redoing our rivers. You can get there too. Yeah, the U of A Press, that's their website right there, the second bullet. And it's fairly easy to find. Somebody was telling me the other day they were Googling it and they actually found it on Amazon, but which was kind of made it real for me. But again, you can order it now. It's not coming out for a few more weeks.
All right, great. Thank you, Mark. We put that link into the chat box so everybody can go to that link and get your book ordered. So, Mark, what was your favorite thing that you learned in pulling this book together?
Man, I learned a lot. I think one of my favorite things that, I guess I'm not so sure I learned, but I felt like I, maybe hopefully knew it before I started writing, was just how vibrant and strong the restoration community is. As I mentioned, at the very beginning of this talk, there are a lot of great people out there doing a lot of great work. And one of the things that I think makes looking at other projects and involving a whole host of people so valuable is a lot of this work is not really well documented. Occasionally you'll see journal articles on it, but we're practitioners inherently. A lot of especially the work that came out of a lot of these case studies, and we're not driven to publish, and so there's a lot of great lessons that are just sort of sitting on the shelf, so to speak, and getting out there to these projects and talking to people that did them and hearing about their challenges and how they addressed them and what their big lessons learned. If they had to do it all over again, was great. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about native fish, for example. I'm not a fish biologist, and it was really cool bringing that community into the stream restoration world fold, so to speak, for the guidebook anyway.
Great, thank you, Mark. Heidi says that she doesn't have a question, but sounds like she's very excited to follow up with this book and one of her projects that she's going to be engaging on. So good luck, Heidi, on your projects. Next is, Mark, do you use or reference a channel evolution model to inform stream restoration in this book?
Yes, we do. There's a variety of different good reference resources that are out there for understanding past conditions and trends of your stream channel, and we focus a lot on one of the main focuses here is on alluvial channels, and so we focus a lot on channel morphologic conditions and how they are altered by changes in sediment and water fluxes, over the time period, and what might be driving those changes and what might be in store for the future with regard to those changes, and then of course how those changes might impact your stream restoration objectives and the tactics that they're using. So yeah, that's a big foundation of the guidebook, particularly in chapter 3, where we spend much of the chapter talking about changes in sediment and water fluxes and how they impact your stream and your restoration objectives.
Thank you, Mark. Next question is, what are the next steps for compiling information and about practitioners' lessons learned?
Next steps. I'm not exactly sure what the
question is what is the next step for compiling more practitioners' lessons learned? Are there next steps, or maybe that's did you learn anything from compiling the book that would better inform compiling more practitioners' lessons learned?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we all learned a lot as we compared notes, because there are something like there's 21 case studies in the book, and then a lot of other examples. So as the 55 authors compared notes and stuff, we all learned a lot from each other. So I guess the next step in terms of the guidebook, I guess there's really two answers to this. One, in terms of the guidebook, one idea that we hope for, it's kind of a fingers crossed idea at this point, is to make at least a couple of chapters live, so that they can be updated, and at least people can access the information a little bit easier, as well as some of the case studies, and that. Well, what our hope is that could evolve in actually, developing links that would bring readers in directly in contact with some of the authors of some of the case studies. And so that's just talk at this point, but that is one next step that we'd like to do. We want to do that both in English and Spanish as well. And then the other one is more off to the side, not so much guidebook, but there are some efforts underway in at least the southwestern US and Australia as well that involve better linkages through electronic media, for example, in Arizona, there's a budding effort called the Arizona Cross Watershed Network, and there's similar ones like it that link practitioners, scientists, etc., that are involved in various aspects of natural resource conservation together, and the information that they're using to develop their programs. And so that is definitely one that's worthy of pursuit, because particularly in these times of big question mark of COVID and everything, is how to bring people together, and share information, in a viable way. So anyway, two thoughts there, Rusty, for that question. Okay. Really came
Great, thank you. This is more of a request. Jim would like to wish you had your camera on so he could put a face to the voice. So if you could oblige Jim and quickly turn on your camera, that would be great.
Well, all right, Jim. Let's see if I can do this.
Mark, with that, I do not see any more questions. So there you go. There's the name to the face to the voice for.
I thought I could hide, Rusty, and I can't hide from.
Yeah. Well, Mark, there's a lot of other comments in the that are basically says thank you to all the practitioners out there. Wish they had it years ago. Thanks to Mark and everyone for pulling all these together. Mark, thank you very much for your presentation and your work in conjunction with all the other experts, and we appreciate you taking time to present on it today, Mark. So
thank you, Rusty. Thanks to everybody.
Yeah.
This is my pleasure. Really appreciate it.
Well, I do want to extend a thank you to everyone that's joined us today. Our next webinar will feature Mark Briggs again, our very own Mark Briggs, Restoration Coordinator at Rivers Edge West. The next one will be October 27th, Adapting Your Stream Restoration Project to Climate Change. So please join us for our next webinar. I also want to thank everyone for participating today. If you do want to continue to have these accessible webinars, please consider joining Rivers Edge West membership program. That membership program allows us to have these experts and subject matter at low cost or free to the public. So please consider joining and supporting our effort for our organization so we can continue to push out information that is so critical to the long-lasting success of these restoration and stream restoration projects. So I put a link on the chat box, or you can go to our website at www.riversedgewest.com. With that, we are out of time, so thank you all, and tune in again on October 27th for our next installment of our webinar series. Have a great day, everyone.